My name is Ayala. I am the founder and now the past president of SafePet Ottawa. I think it's important for us to tell our own stories so that you understand why we may do the things we do on behalf of survivors of domestic violence. Mostly it's because we have a personal understanding of domestic violence, and mine goes back 2 generations. People say karma is a bitch, but I think karma is an opportunity. When the right things came together, I began to realize why SafePet meant so much to me. And it's associated with a story about a dog. My grandmother was born in Lithuania. Sometime during the war, my grandfather was conscripted. When he came back, he was a changed and broken man. He came back an alcoholic, and he came back to discover that he had another child. And although my mother was his spitting image, he refused to believe that she was his. In the interim between beating up my grandmother and ignoring my mother and destroying her life as much as possible, he managed to impregnate my grandmother so often that there were ultimately 10 children. When my mother was 11, she came home one day to find standing at her mother's feet a large German Shepherd. She said she thought it was a German Shepherd. She called him an Alsatian, and my grandmother, who did not speak English or French, said that this was Wolf. My mother had never been that close to a dog that size. Neither had her siblings, and she was a little frightened of him. And her mother did not tell her where Wolf came from. Wolf, by the way, if you haven't guessed, means wolf. However, what she saw as soon as my grandfather came barreling in the house ready to beat up my grandmother was Wolf stand up and start growling. He never went close to him, he just stood up and growled. My grandfather apparently backed away, said, "Get rid of this animal." My grandmother said no. It was the first time she ever said no to him, and he left the house. In my mother's mind's eye, she had a protector. Her mother had a protector, and perhaps she would too, because until Wolf showed up, because she was less than nothing in her father's eyes, her 2 oldest brothers started raping her when she was 7. And I don't know what suicide feels like to a 7-year-old, but she was suicidal. She was terrified of her own siblings. Her mother couldn't seem to protect her, and her father made her valueless. When Wolf walked into the house, her father suddenly had to retreat from beating her mother. If he took a step towards my grandmother, the dog would stand up, stand between them, and growl. If my mother's brothers started edging towards her when no one else was around, suddenly Wolf would be there. I want to remind you that German Shepherds originally were working dogs, herding dogs. Someone had given my grandmother this dog. To this day, we don't know who. And he had a herd now. From the moment Wolf walked in the house, it ceased to be dysfunctional. He would get up with my grandmother every morning. He slept next to her so that my grandfather would leave her alone. wake up my aunts and uncles, hustle them into the bathroom to get washed for school, hustle them into the kitchen, and start escorting the younger ones to school. Wolf would pick up the youngest children at school, hustle them up the spiral staircases that were common in the back alleys of Montreal, one by one if he had to, hustle them into the kitchen, go under the table while they ate a snack, did whatever they did, and did their homework. Stand by my grandmother as soon as my grandfather walked in the door. Because it was the Depression, they didn't have a lot of money. They didn't have money to buy food for the dog. Every child took a tablespoon-sized spoon and took from their plate at every meal to give to Wolf. The house developed some kind of normalcy for the next 4 years. Wolf was more a father to my mother than her own father. If it was cold, Wolf slept with her and her sisters in their beds. If she cried at night from nightmares, he woke her up. And still we did not know where Wolf came from. We only know that he was there, and that something in this dog kept everyone safe from my grandfather and from my 2 oldest uncles. When my mother was 14, as she was about to turn 15, she came home from the factory one day and Wolf was not there. And my grandfather had backed my grandmother into a corner. The dog's not here anymore. You're mine. And he was going to start beating her again. My mother had been afraid all of her life. But what would Wolf have done? She picked up a heavy ashtray, tapped her father on the shoulder, and said, "I'm her dog now," and knocked him out with it. My mother told me this when I was in my late teens, and she said, "My father taught me nothing. Wolf taught me to be unafraid." When I was a very little girl, I used to think my mother never let me breathe. She was always where I was. This explained why. She was protecting me. Years ago, when she told me this story, she said, "I need you to remember what I learned from this dog." What I learned was, you stand up for yourself. You stand up for people who are smaller and weaker or larger and weaker than yourself. And you make no excuses to bullies. Karma is not a bitch. Karma is an opportunity. I think SafePet gave me an opportunity to fulfill something that my mother would have wished for, that my grandmother would have wished for. There were no VAW shelters until the 1960s or 70s, and certainly they didn't take animals. So this is a difficult story to tell you. I am telling you that I am the product of 2 generations of domestic violence. My mother was abused horribly. Her mother was abused horribly. But I am also telling you that I owe a debt to a dog I never met. So this is allowing me to repay a karmic debt I have no doubt my grandfather would have killed my grandmother, and nothing would have happened. I have no doubt my mother's life would have been continually destroyed, and she would have killed herself. I have no doubt in my mind that the reason my mother was so protective of everyone she met, whether her own children or anyone else's, was because of this. And so this is my debt being repaid. De Wolf. Please support SafePet Ottawa. Help children exit. Otherwise, the damage continues down from one generation to the next. Thank you.